Hello and welcome back to my channel. Bonjour et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and it's time for another monthly reading wrap-up. In the month of August, I read a total of 8 books, comprising 4 books of fiction, 1 book of non-fiction, and 3 books of graphic, broadly speaking, non-fiction. This time around, though, this wrap-up is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to first talk about, well, most of the books I've read this past month, and then at the end of my wrap-up, I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about the 1 non-fiction book I read this month, Material Girls: Why Reality Matters for Feminism, and basically do a bit of a mini review and explain some of my positions with regards to the material covered in that book. So this means I'm going to go through all the other books I read first, do a first little conclusion, so if you want to leave off at that moment you can, and then go into my mini review of Material Girls. But first, I will be going through the fiction I read last month. So first, I read The Book of Dragons. This is an anthology edited by Jonathan Strahan, and features a pretty nice variety of authors, some very well known like R.F. Kuang, writer of the Poppy War series, the author of the Gentleman Bastard series, whose name I obviously cannot recall right at this moment, because that's always how it goes, isn't it? And just, yeah, a wide variety of authors, male, female, so that was really neat. And, well, the theme is dragons. It's an anthology celebrating the dragon, this awesome mythological creature you find in so many cultures around the world, whether it be in its Western form with, 6 limbs, or even the wyvern subtype with 4 limbs, or its more Eastern Asian form, which is more, the lung, which is very serpentine and associated with water and things like that. It's an anthology, so there are different genres represented in this book. Like, the theme is dragons, but it's treated not just under a fantasy lens, but also a magical realism lens, a science fiction lens, a blend of genres lens. So that was really neat as well. And overall, I was extremely happily surprised by this anthology. My usual experience with anthologies has thus far been, I tend to enjoy them, and there are stories I don't really care for, and stories I find highly enjoyable. With this one, it's like the most consistently good anthology I've ever come across. The vast majority of stories in this were like a 7 out of 10 or above. I had a few duds here and there, but they were, honestly in the minority. Yeah, it was a really, really good anthology. Like, I would just really highly recommend it if you like anthologies of speculative fiction, and more obviously than that, if you're a dragon fan, a dragon nerd, like I undoubtedly am myself. Yeah, I had a great time with this anthology. My favorite story personally was, I can't remember its title, but it's actually more of a magical realism story than anything else. And it references Ursula K. Le Guin and Earthsea, and it's just really sweet and nice and quietly magical, and I really like that. I will mention something though. There is a story in this anthology which features the usage of non-binary pronouns, which isn't something I've come across before in literature. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't have an issue using preferred non-binary pronouns out of courtesy, politeness, consideration, what have you, even though personally I'm not a big fan of the they-them usage for a single individual right in front of me. To me, it kind of hurts my brain, but fine, I can accommodate for that. And made-up pronouns, I think it forces language in a way that isn't natural, but again, fine. In writing, however, it doesn't work. I'm sorry, it just does not work. That story was a chore to read because of that. And beyond the linguistic aspects, it wasn't that great of a story. It was one of the duds in this collection, not just for that reason, but my honest opinion, I'm sorry, but non-binary pronouns in writing are clunky as fuck. It's not even an ideological consideration, it feels clunky in writing. And induces confusion, I might add. There was the usage of a zir pronoun to refer to a dragon deity. My brain automatically substituted him, her, when I ran across those words, because those words are just not naturally within my English language repertoire, right? But regardless of that, there were other legitimate duds in this anthology that had nothing to do with the linguistic aspects, if you will, but otherwise, a great anthology. And I'd also like to add that there was poetry as well. It wasn't just a collection of short stories, there were some pieces of poetry, and some of them I highly enjoyed as well. So really a great anthology overall, and I would highly, highly recommend it if you are a great lover of dragons, if nothing else. And then I read 2 fantasy masterworks this past month as well. First, I read Little Big by John Crowley, and I also read Thomas the Rhymer by Ellen Kushner. I did a dual review for both of these, if you want to check it out. And I mean, I paired them in my review because they both have to do somewhat with the world of fairy and folklore around fairies, fairyland, etc. Little Big more specifically revolves around a family throughout several generations who live in this magically liminal house called Edgewood and their entanglement with the world of fairy. However, I didn't personally really like this novel. This was the 4th most disappointing read of 2021. I didn't think there was much plot to speak of, not that much fairy presence to speak of. I thought the characterization was lackluster. The writing was fairly nice, I'll give it that, and there was a nice dreamlike atmosphere to a lot of the story, if you can call it that. And I wasn't a big fan of the romance present in this book as well, so I was just left wanting a lot and was quite actively bored at times as well. And then for Thomas the Rhymer, I enjoyed this more, though I wouldn't by any means call this a great reading experience either. I gave this a 6 out of 10. Little Big I gave a 4 out of 10. This is a semi-historical fantasy novel looking at the semi-historical figure, I think, of Thomas the Rhymer, who was a bard, sort of, in medieval Scotland, who apparently was whisked to Elfland for 7 years, and then when he came back, couldn't lie anymore and could even sort of see into the future. And it was a nice, warm little tale, is the best way I can put it. None of these books, in my opinion, had much theming going for them, but in this case, I was more emotionally impacted by the story, and it felt warm, I guess. I just can't really put it any way else. So yeah, it was an agreeable reading experience, I'll put it that way. And then last week, I read The Doors of Eden by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Another chonker. A pretty heavy chonker as well because it's a hardback. So, The Doors of Eden was a very entertaining read. I had a lot of fun with it. I didn't like it as much as Children of Time or Children of Ruin. I don't think the theming is as deep. I don't think the world building is as richly realized or as convincing quite as that you get in Children of Time and or Children of Ruin. The character work was just fine for what it needed to be, basically. It was a very plot-driven story, and it was just a good time. It was a romp. It was an imaginative, science fiction-based romp. The way I qualified it in my Goodreads review was if Dan Brown wrote a more specifically science fiction-y story. I did snack avidly on the bits of speculative evolutionary biology that was put on display in this book. It presents several different kinds of speculative evolution in this novel. Doesn't really go that deeply into any one of those strands, unlike in Children of Time. So I was left a bit wanting once again. I should probably quickly say what this is about. So you have these 2 women who are a lesbian couple. They are cryptozoologists. They hunt for, like, Yetis, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, things like that. And one of the women falls through a crack in the fabric of the universe, and she basically gets lost into an alternative version of Earth. And then there's a bit of a spy story going on with a dude working at MI5. This all takes place in Great Britain, I should add. There's also this, a bit cartoonish, I have to admit, a bit cartoonish villain who wants to do nefarious shit involving parallel versions of Earth. And there is a trans woman mathematician who worked with the government who is also involved in cracking a way of communicating that doesn't rely on cable-based technology. And the gist of it is that basically there are parallel versions of Earth, and each parallel version of Earth has had a different evolutionary history because at certain critical points in the evolution of life on Earth, there were divergences. And so you have these interludes between the chapters of the main storyline that kind of explain to you how evolution sort of turned out in XYZ parallel version of Earth, and those species became sentient. I mean, that's the important bit about this, is that in these different parallel versions of Earth, different types of animal species rose to sentience and, more significantly, to a kind of civilization akin to that of Homo sapiens in our reality. So you have a world where dromaeosaur people arose. I call them dinoburbs. I love those. Didn't get nearly enough of them. I'm very pissed about that, by the way. It's very neat. Like, I love this kind of stuff, right? I devour that kind of stuff. But since it was going in so many directions at once, it didn't get that deep. And at times it wasn't terribly plausible, or not as plausibly developed as what you get with the spiders in Children of Time, basically. It was loads of fun. It was just fun. I give this a solid 7 out of 10. Sure, there are big cracks in like the sciencey world building. It's not nearly as hard science fiction as Children of Time and Children of Ruin, but it was a good time. So yeah, pick this up if you want to have a good time based in science fiction and just enjoy the ride. And now I'm going to move on to the graphic stuff. So first, I read a comic book called Tamara de Lempicka. This takes a look at the life of the female artist Tamara de Lempicka, more specifically during the 1920s-ish, during the mounting successfulness of her career, basically, as a painter. It shows you the way she lived, her bisexuality as well, and I guess it focuses in on what led her to creating one of her more well-known paintings of a pretty lascivious female nude. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed the art style. This is what it looks like inside, and I found it interesting. There's a bit of written biography at the end to give you more context on this artist, her life, her work, and more interestingly perhaps, the way she's been rehabilitated in more recent times. And art historians and the art world is retaking a look at her work and artistic legacy, a bit like they're doing with Artemisia Gentileschi from the Renaissance. So it was very interesting. It was informative. I like the art style. I enjoyed the representation of female bisexuality as well. I would have liked more, though. I feel like this is the kind of character, historical figure, who could have benefited from the kind of treatment Anaïs Nin gets in Anaïs Nin sur la mer des mensonges by Léonie Bischoff, which is now my favorite graphic novel of all time, because the art style is very nice. So like a chunkier comic book about that would have been great, in my opinion. So yeah, I just wanted more. But still, I gave this a solid 7 out of 10. For a standard issue in the French-speaking world, I mean, of like a 46, 50-ish pages comic book, it was really good. And then last week, I wrapped up the month with 2 additional volumes of graphic non-fiction, although those books were significantly chunkier than Tamara de Lempicka. So I read L'incroyable histoire de la littérature française. Translated, this would be The Incredible History of French Literature. Chunky, like I said, this is about 280 pages. It goes through the history of French literature in the format of a comic book graphic novel, basically. And it was thoroughly enjoyable. It was very interesting. This basically felt to me as if I was going through my French literature classes in secondary school again. Now, to some people, that might sound horrible, but I really loved those classes in school. Literature was one of my favorite subjects alongside history and biology, and I, went through a lot of the stuff I'd actually studied in class in secondary school. So it was neat to have my memory refreshed on various different authors, and then I learned a lot more about additional authors which I didn't really go over in school, and this really goes into details. I have to give this book points for being thorough and really taking the time to tell you about ex-author's life, works. It also kind of gives you synopsises of some of the more important works of XYZ authors. It's a really good overview of the subject. I think there are about 30 authors featured in this. Sadly, there are only a few female authors, and by a few I mean 3, but I mean, there's a reason for that, historically speaking. It goes from the 16th to the 20th century, and I guess I was a bit miffed that there was no mention of Jules Verne. I mean, Jules Verne is like one of the founding fathers of science fiction, I think specifically science fiction in French. So, as an SFF lover, I would have enjoyed that little bit of representation, especially in French, because I don't really read SFF in French. So I was like, missed opportunity there. I mean, it's fine. They couldn't include everyone, obviously, but lots of big names in there. Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Voltaire, Montaigne, Montesquieu, Victor Hugo, Émile Zola. Oh god, that one was so annoying in school. And I mean, Baudelaire. I mean, I do love Les Fleurs du Mal, though he was a despicable misogynistic sod. If you enjoy the subject of the history of literature, in this case French literature, give this one a try. If you read French, if you want a refresher course on what you learned in high school / secondary school, this is a good way to go, quite honestly. And then alongside that, I read l'incroyable Histoire du Sexe, volume 2, de l'Afrique à l'Asie. So I read volume 1 of this book, I guess you would call it. Volume 1, which is basically a history of the evolution of sexual mores in the West, more specifically, though, I mean, it starts in prehistory, then kind of takes a look at Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, so that's not really Western culture, but okay, whatever. Kind of a chronological progression of the practices of human sexuality and sexual mores, like I said, and cultural customs to do with marriage, relationships, etc., etc. And this volume takes a closer look at that topic, but for non-Western cultures, more specifically though, Africa, the entire African continent, and there's a bit of an issue with that, which I'll get to in a second, the Middle East, China, India, and Japan. Now, it's fine to have a chapter for China, India, Japan, though even there are limitations, because those are huge countries with very rich and long histories and, very rich cultures, but fine, you got a country and a chapter to go with that country, but then there's one chapter for the entire African continent, and I'm like, Africa, encompasses a lot of different cultures with varying histories, so I felt like that was a bit unfair, that treatment, but okay, fine. And there was nothing regarding Polynesia, Micronesia, or South America, pre-Columbian South America, so, I mean, they could have made it chunkier and explored those areas of the world as well, but fine. It was interesting. It was also quite funny at times, by virtue of the way the subject matter is drawn and the little comments that go with some of the drawings, though at times it really veers into very dark humor territory, but I didn't necessarily mind, though at times I was like, you're really flirting with the line there. The only issue I have, which is an issue I had with volume 1, is that the author relies on sources which are sometimes quite questionable and very old, like sources that go back to before the 1950s, and I'm like, when you're talking about, the humanities, the softer sciences, such as sociology, anthropology, a lot of stuff has been reconceptualized over the years, reanalyzed under more unbiased lenses. So, I mean, a lot of the information has been updated with the years. And so it wasn't updated here because the sources were probably, in a lot of cases, outdated. And so several times I was like, but I mean, is that really the case? Or is that some, excuse me for doing this, some white dude from the 1920s interpretation of said thing? So, at times I wasn't sure if I should just believe the author or not, and at times I did think it lacked clarity, or it lacked nuance, or I felt it could have gone a bit more in depth to explain certain things. I mean, I understand it's a limited amount of pages, a limited amount of space to illustrate things, but it's a fascinating topic. Like, it's one of my favorite areas of interest, human sexuality throughout culture, the arts, etc. And I feel like this deserved a much bigger page count and a finer analysis. Otherwise, it was fairly enjoyable, and I'm still happy I read it, and I'm happy I can, put it away alongside volume 1. But overall, I think it sits at a 6.5 out of 10, which isn't bad by any means. And yeah, this one sits at between a 7.5 and an 8 out of 10. It was really good. Okay, and now I'm going to move on to my mini review within this monthly reading wrap-up of Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism by Professor Kathleen Stock. So first, I'm going to state this outright. I am technically speaking what people call a gender-critical feminist, in the sense that my feminism, as I understand it, has always been critical of gender. It has always been so, and long before gender-critical feminism even became a thing on the internet and in real life. That is what brought me to feminist theory. It's because I was gender non-conforming as a child. I did not fit into the stereotypes associated with girls and then women. So yeah, I've always been gender non-conforming to a greater or lesser extent. And so I didn't understand this idea that being a girl was just anything more than having a girl's body and then a woman's body. So I was just very confused and alienated by that. And with age and time, that brought me to reading into feminism. That's what brought me to reading things like Delusions of Gender and Testosterone Rex by Cordelia Fine. That's what keeps me reading books like The Gendered Brain by Gina Rippon, or Inferior by Angela Saini, or, in the near future, Gender Mosaic by Daphne Joel and Luba Vikansky, I think is her name. That is the basis of my feminism, and I always understood it to be one of the building blocks of feminist theory, period. I ended up on Reddit for a complete different topic, by the way. And one thing led to another, and I started becoming aware that there was a conflict between certain feminist activists, feminist thinkers, and others allied to certain branches of the trans rights activist movement. Before that, I'd never really given much thought to trans people. I knew they existed. The way I understood it is that some individuals, for whatever reason, have this deep-seated distress at having the sex body they have, and that causes them a tremendous amount of pain. And my reaction was that, oh dear, that must be freaking horrible. I feel sad for these people. I hope they can deal with it by transitioning, whatever. So I was very confused when I came across this conflict, which now has taken much greater proportions, and I just came across stuff that made no sense to me as a feminist, but also as a biology-minded person, since I have studied a bit of biology, love nature, am interested in zoology, botany, the natural world, and I came across stuff that just didn't make an ounce of sense to me, and I was like, what the hell is happening? So that's the context of how I got into the subject, and I got in deep. I read so many arguments from different sides of the debate. I'm extremely well versed in this weird little subtopic, which is, like I said, actually becoming a lot more prominent in wider societal discourse now. Disclaimer then. So yes, I am technically a gender critical feminist, or I am a feminist whose feminism is intrinsically critical of gender. What does that mean? That means that I believe that sex exists. Sex is a material reality. Sex is not a social construct, if only by virtue of the fact that it doesn't just exist in human beings. It exists in a shit ton of living organisms on planet Earth. But gender is the set of societal expectation placed, pressured upon individuals according to their sex. It's the set of personality traits, behaviors assigned and attributed to people according to their sex. And that is a system, I personally believe, enforced by what we call patriarchy or androcracy. I think there are different words for that concept. And it is largely, if not entirely, harmful, and I contest that system. You also have gender identity. Personally, gender identity is absolutely meaningless to me as a concept, though, and I'll get back to this in my review proper, Professor Kathleen actually provided a definition of gender identity, which does make at least a modicum of sense to me. That I can kind of get behind, but the way gender identity is described, it's not even really defined or described by, again, a certain branch of the trans rights activist movement, makes zero sense to me. And I contest the fact that everyone has this gender identity. I do not have a gender identity. I am not a cis woman. I'm just a woman. Because to me, being a woman or being a man is just being an adult member of the species Homo sapiens of either sex. Does that mean I hate trans people? No, that is just such a weird assumption made about people who hold my intellectual position. I do not wish violence upon trans people. I do not wish trans people to be barred from access to gainful employment, to housing, to adapted and adequate medical care, or to, like, the military, like they did in the United States. I don't understand why believing the things I believe means you hate a group of people, or you erase their existence. That to me is also just the weirdest of concepts. Just because you have a certain intellectual position doesn't mean you blip someone out of existence. The only area I'm going to admit I'm just a bit less patient is non-binary stuff. I just fundamentally do not understand non-binary stuff. To me, we're all, psychologically speaking, non-binary. I fundamentally don't get it, especially the non-binary people who don't transition in any way, shape, or form. I know for a fact that there are non-binary individuals who do transition to presumably an androgynous state, an in-between state of being perceived as male or female. But like a person who just looks like a man and was born a man and just declares I'm non-binary because sometimes I put on eyeliner. I'm like, why can you just be a dude wearing eyeliner? That's a lot more progressive and fighting against gender than calling yourself non-binary. It's a bit weird to me, but okay, whatever. So Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism by Professor Kathleen Stark. This is, again, straight up, it is a gender critical, want to qualify it that way, treatise, looking at different things. It traces a short history of how we got to where we are with regards to this debate between some feminists and some parts of society more generally, and other feminists aligned with trans rights activism, or at least the now most prominent and loudest branch of trans rights activism, because like anyone else, trans people are not a monolith. Not all trans people agree with the party line, so to speak, things like that. So she goes through that history. She goes over several theoretical concepts that have led to where we are today, even theoretical concepts that have basically been twisted out of their original context. Like, take for example, the famous phrase by Simone de Beauvoir, "One is not born but made a woman, on ne naît pas femme, on le devient." Anyone who reads Simone de Beauvoir will understand what she actually meant when she said that phrase, but of course nowadays it has been twisted out of all recognizable shape, unfortunately. A lot is said about Judith Butler, who is one of the, I don't know if she was one of the main, but she's one of the big names in academic queer feminist theory, which again revolves around ideas such as there's no such thing as objective reality, language is what creates reality, and thus all the concepts we have don't actually have an independent existence outside of the words humans created to designate them, which is how you get ideas like even biological sex is a social construct. And then she kind of deconstructs a lot of arguments put forward by some, again, of these trans rights activists. First, she goes through this idea now that's circulating that sex is a social construct, all sex is a spectrum, and you cannot say they're just males and females because X, Y, Z. She gives several definitions of sex, 3 working definitions of sex that can work for human beings, some which can work for more than just human beings, and she explains how all of these definitions are still valuable and that recognizing the existence of the sexes in human beings is still something we profoundly, fundamentally need for different reasons, but, one of the big ones being the fight for women's rights, right? She then goes through the concept of gender identity. Like I said, I do not personally agree that everyone has a gender identity. I don't know what a gender identity means, at least as not defined by some trans rights activists, some queer theorists, and some third, fourth wave feminists, whatever you want to call them. So she kind of goes through different possible definitions for gender identity theory, and then she offers one which actually, for once, makes a modicum of sense, but still maintains that, in her opinion, just like me, not everyone has one. Some people have one. A lot of people who have a gender identity will probably be trans, but she argues that you can have a gender identity and not be trans. I mean, she gives argumentation for it. She talks about, like, gender non-conforming people and gay people. I'm not going to go into the details, but it was a very interesting part of the book as well. The issue with the current loudest iteration of the trans rights activist movement, allied with a certain subset of the feminist movement, is that gender identity is something everyone has, and gender identity should be more important and considered primarily in legislation over sex. That's what leads to the debates you might have heard of around the concept of self-ID. Self-ID is, once again, if you're not aware, the idea that you can just one day up and declare yourself a woman or a man, or presumably a non-binary person, just like that, because the only thing required to be considered trans non-binary, is an inner feeling of being either a woman, a man, or a non-binary person, relying on nothing else, relying on nothing objective, material, observable, and acknowledgeable by other human beings around you. So she goes through this concept of gender identity, deconstructs it with a lot of rigor, but a lot of fairness as well. She's very respectful. She's always very respectful throughout the book. I really want to stress this. And then she goes into what I will call her very original contribution to this discussion. She posits that the reason why society now, I mean increasingly so, is going along with this rhetoric put forward by a lot of trans rights activists is not so much because they fundamentally agree with it or believe it. It is because we are collectively immersed in a fiction. So she goes through what that means. It's similar to what you experience when you read a good book, a good piece of fiction. You are immersed in a world, and you do know that it's not literally real, but you're still immersed in it. You can still believe in it. That's why when something breaks the world building or breaks the pacing, your suspension of disbelief is broken, right? And you're taken out and you're like, what happened? Same thing happens when you go to the cinema, when you go to a play. You go along with this created fictional reality. You do know it's not literally real, but you're engaged in it. And she says it's a perfectly natural phenomenon for human beings. It's a phenomenon which can be extremely beneficial to human beings, both on an individual and a collective level, but it can also have deleterious effects, especially with what we're currently seeing with the excesses of, once again, some trans rights activists and their allies within feminism and progressive circles. So I thought that was a very interesting contribution. I'd never thought about this that way, so it really made me think, and I thought, yeah, it was a worthwhile contribution to that just broader discussion. Of course, she also catalogues the different issues and concerns. A lot of feminists who can be gender critical, who can be radical feminists as well, with the excesses of the trans rights activist movement. Again, I was familiar with all of that. There's the concerns about predators being led into female prisons, the unfairness of introducing male-bodied people or people who have had the advantages of a male puberty entering female sports, and then grants as well, because from the moment you allow people to just register in like administration, in medicine, in grants, in universities, etc., as the opposite sex, just because you say you feel like it, then that just opens the door for so many abuses and excesses. She also talks about, and that actually I really care about, the lack of sex-specific data in medicine, in, ergonomics. The stuff talked about in Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, that stuff is greatly put at risk by self-ID. And funny enough, I might add that on Goodreads, some people have accused that book of being transphobic. QED. And of course, there's this idea that you can't talk about female-specific language anymore without offending a trans woman. Like, you have to say pregnant people now, you can't say pregnant women, or you have to say menstruators. Anecdotally, that shit would get so effing clunky in French, because in French, everything is gender. That really pisses me off, because I'm like, I'm sorry, you don't just change the entire structure of language to accommodate a tiny minority of the population. You can on an individual basis, again, out of kindness, out of consideration, but on a structural, institutional level, no, that's not how it works. And finally, she concludes with a chapter on suggestions on how to go forward, on how to find compromises, constructive and productive compromises between the feminists who have increasingly become sick and tired of this shit, and, the trans people who do want to fight legitimately so for their rights, and just trying to find a way to get along in a way that doesn't impinge on anyone's rights. It's fine to fight for your rights, but your rights cannot come at the cost of mine, basically. That's kind of the idea. It's not even a piece of criticism, it's more a disagreement. Because yes, you can disagree with someone and agree with a lot of the other things they say. I've said this in other videos, we can disagree on things and still respect one another, and I think this needs to be repeated a lot more today. She says, for example, that one of the concerns of some gender-critical feminists and activists is something to do with a thing called the spousal veto, that apparently if you want to transition as a trans person, you need the permission of your spouse. And I'm like, who gives a crap about that? I'm sorry, you shouldn't need the approval of your spouse to go through a medical procedure. That is patently absurd to me. If a person is an adult, they're capable of making decisions for themselves, especially when it comes to their health. Your spouse has absolutely nothing to say about that. It's exactly like with sterilization. In my country, if you're married, apparently you need the permission of your spouse to get a tubal ligation or a vasectomy, and I'm like, fuck that. I'm sorry, that is repulsive. Just because you marry someone, you don't own them. So I'm like, no, I'm sorry, if you're a trans person and you're an adult and you want to transition, that's between you and your doctors. Conversely though, if the spouse chooses to divorce you because it just doesn't work with them afterwards, that is fine as well, and they shouldn't be judged for that either. So in conclusion, I would highly recommend this book. Of course, as I've made patently clear, I'm extremely biased, but truly, I mean, this person, this woman, is respectful. She's not vitriolic in the slightest. So yeah, read this if you want to garner more information on this topic from a very respectful, not neutral, but very fair point of view. A person who is very fair to the arguments put forward by her opponents. Read this if you are gender critical and you want just a more academic presentation of the arguments you're familiar with, which might then help you in your personal debates in real life or the internet. And even if you're just kind of a normie in the middle, you just kind of want to know what's going on, and this could potentially help you form your own opinion about the subject. And that concludes my August reading wrap-up plus mini-review. In the month of September, I'm going to read a couple of classics. I'm going to be reading The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I'll be reading The Tenant of Wellfield Hall by Anne Bronte. I'll be delving into additional fantasy with the chunky standalone that is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I'll also be dipping my toes into some Susanna Clarke with Piranesi. As usual, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Take good care of yourselves, wherever you are, however you are, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye!